Hello and welcome. Let's start with US President Donald Trump's Africa policy. Here is his latest stance on the continent. The US President sees Africa as a strategic partner and not a charity case. Now, who said this? His envoy for Africa, Massad Boulos. Now, Boulos met African Union Chief Mahmoud Ali Youssouf on Wednesday. The two leaders held talks in Ethiopia's capital of Addis Ababa. This was followed by a media briefing where the US envoy made remarks on Trump's Africa policy.
President Trump sees Africa not as a charity case, but as a strategic partner. Our policies are guided by respect, by realism, and by results. We are here to support leaders who pursue peace, protect their people, and promote prosperity through private enterprise and rule of law. That's why we are committed to supporting African-led efforts to resolve conflicts, combat terrorism, and strengthen regional stability.
Since returning to the White House, Trump's policies have not been very kind to Africa. He imposed high tariffs, he drastically cut US aid, and his stringent visa policies are making it more and more difficult for Africans to travel to the US. But at the same time, Trump is also eyeing access to Africa's mineral wealth and is treating the continent as a dumping ground for migrants that he wants to remove from the US. The partnership seems more or less lopsided, heavily tilted in Washington's favor. Yet the Trump administration is endorsing the US president as Africa's friend, and one of his most favorite roles have been that of peacemaker. One of the key issues discussed between the US envoy and the AU chief was the conflict in the DRC. The US envoy reiterated Trump's call for a ceasefire in the region.
President Trump believes strongly that all parties involved are ready for peace. Now, he expects them to prove that readiness, not in words, but in action. We are working hard to make that happen, and I have urged the AU to redouble its efforts to support this process for a durable peace.
Back in June, Trump brokered a peace deal between DRC and the M23 backer Rwanda. Trump even claimed that he had stopped the decades-long conflict. But reports show that the war is actually far from over. Reportedly, the DRC army and the M23 rebels continue to clash, accusing each other of violating the ceasefire terms. Another African nation where President Trump wants to bring peace is the Sudan. A war between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary RSF has devastated the country. But there too, Trump's peacemaking efforts have hit a snag. Just last week, Sudan's army-aligned government pushed back against a new peace proposal that's backed by Washington. The Sudanese government has rejected foreign interference, plus the fresh US sanctions on Sudanese finance minister and a pro-army militia make it even more unlikely for Trump to broker a truce anytime soon. But it is equally unlikely for the US president to give up on his global peacemaking branding. Now, another regional issue where the Sudan is a key player is around Ethiopia's newly inaugurated dam on the Blue Nile. It is Africa's largest dam and has been at the center of conflict between Ethiopia and its downstream neighbors, Egypt and Sudan. The US has backed Ethiopia's rival, Egypt, in the conflict. In his first term, Trump even suggested that Egypt might blow up the dam. But during the latest meeting with the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Trump's envoy hailed Ethiopia's importance in fostering regional stability. So, on one hand, Africa is paying the price for Trump's America First policy. But on the other, Washington cannot completely sever ties with the resource-rich continent. where its rivals, Moscow and Beijing, are rapidly expanding their footprint. Now, for more on this, we have with us Khani Magubane, a political analyst who is joining us live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you for being with us, Khani.
A very good afternoon to you and your viewers. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, President Trump calls Africa a strategic partner, not a charity case. But then his administration seeks major aid cuts. How do you explain this contradiction? What does it suggest about Washington's long-term goals in Africa?
Well, I think that the US's long-term goals have a lot to do with cutting strategic foreign aid in order to bring many African countries to their knees. Because once many countries stop receiving that foreign aid, they become more amenable to negotiate with the US for the many mutual interest investments that they claim many American businesses want to make into the African continent. Now, just to bring clarity in terms of America saying that Africa is not a charity case, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the White House hosted a lunch in July with African leaders from countries like Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and Liberia. And, it was stated there that they are changing their approach to foreign aid, that it's not going to be a charity-based foreign aid, but that it's going to be aid that is looking at mutually beneficial relationships, business relationships between countries that can help themselves. Now, the danger with that is that it's moving away from, I would say, goodwill, to say that we are going to help you as a gesture of goodwill or because of humanitarian need in your country. But they are moving towards an approach of saying, what can the Americans get? What can the Americans get out of this deal? Like you mentioned earlier on, America is heavily invested in mineral resources of Africa. That's a bargaining chip. That's something that they want. And when they talk about peace, we must view it strategically to say peace for the Americans means an American-friendly solution. What my fear is and my concern is many of the strategic relationships they are building are not with powerhouses like South Africa or Nigeria, who are seen as very anti-US administration. They're building strategic relationships with smaller economies that don't have bargaining power, that don't have the autonomy. So when we talk about solutions that are mutually beneficial, they will always be in the favor of the Americans. And so my question is, what then becomes the role of the AU? As we've seen the Envoy meeting with the AU chairperson, my question is, are they trying to capture the AU? Because once the AU becomes captured by the Americans, it's going to be very difficult for them not to toe the American line.
And Khani, the US envoy says that policies toward Africa are guided by respect, realism, and results. What practical changes might African nations expect compared to past administrations? And how might this affect relationships with the AU and with individual states?
The difficulty here is that the AU is supposed to be a custodian of African leadership. It's supposed to be a body that is responsible for overseeing peace processes in the country. Yet we have the Americans parading their peace processes and taking credit for victories in places like Rwanda and the Eastern DRC. And those should be AU territories. So weakening an AU in favor for bringing in the Americans to come and broker a peace deal, that is very concerning for me, because once again, it takes away the bargaining power. African policies need to be led by African countries, and our peace and security needs to, to also show as such. But Africa is currently facing many domestic wars. We have civil wars, we still have a lot of violence, and we still have a lot of political immigrants and refugees fleeing and running away from their country. And the question comes down to, who does it all benefit? Who does Africa's political instability benefit? It benefits the people who will swoop in as the heroes at the end of the day. And when they swoop in as heroes and they negotiate these plans, they want something in return. There is no such thing as a free lunch in politics. So I'm very wary to be optimistic about this new move of US saying that they are seeing Africa as a strategic partner. I'm not entirely convinced about it.
Absolutely. Connie, thank you for being with us. As always, great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much.
Firstpost now available in 9 languages on YouTube. English,
Stands at $36 trillion.
French,
Le FMI, comme
German,
Geschäftsführenden Direktor,
Hindi,
$30 trillion kakarjo.
Indonesian,
Pemerintah tanpa pemeriksaan.
Italian,
Sekali radikali.
Japanese,
4兆ドル以上も
Portuguese,
por causa do próprio balanço patrimonial.
Spanish.
Beautiful bill.
Go to Settings, click on Audio Track and select a language of your choice. Be the first to know what's happening around you in your first language. Firstpost.